Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to paint this cute bread slice with butter and strawberry jam. This was inspired by a picture I saw on Pinterest a while ago. Luckily I could find it again. I didn't really paint side by side. Instead, I just like the idea of shaping the jam like tiny little strawberries, but I'll still leave a link to the reference image in the description box in case you need it. I always like to sketch out the focal point first, so the bread is the first thing that I made, making sure I like the size. This way I can frame the rest of the elements surrounding it. You can follow the reference image for this, but I just wanted to include my own items. I decided to include a couple of strawberries on the larger spaces and some small white flowers to complement the strawberries. I also drew out some circles to fill the rest of the space as jam splatters, and on the top left I added some random decorative elements for the sake of filling the space. Now, as for the jam itself, I just shaped them as the strawberries but made them flat and all facing the same angle. On the side, if there are some weird spaces, I just fill it in with half a strawberry, because if I leave it empty, there will be too much empty space. The line that I'm drawing here will be the butter spread, and that's basically it for the sketch. I'll paint the leaves freehand later on. Now moving on to the color, I'll be using Paynes Grey Bluish by Schmincke, Sepia by Holbein, Quin Sienna by Daniel Smith, Grey of Grey by Holbein, Yellow Ochre by Holbein, Jaune Brilliant Dark by Schmincke, Hooker's Green by Cotman, Hansa Yellow Medium by Daniel Smith, Vermilion by Holbein, and Crimson Lake by Holbein. I'm also going to use Bleed Proof White, but that's only for correction. Now let's begin to paint. I'm starting with Jaune Brilliant Dark, and I applied a medium consistency on a random area. Then I spread it out using a clean wet brush so the paint becomes nice and light and also a little bit uneven in certain areas. I just want a really light coverage over the butter spread, and I also want it to be applied unevenly so it's slightly textured. Once the base of the butter spread is lightly covered and the surface is still a little bit damp, I'm going to take a slightly thicker consistency of the same color, and I'm just going to apply random lines to suggest some textures for the butter. After this, I'm going to add yellow ochre and a little bit of gray into the Jaune Brilliant Dark. I'm still working with a medium to light consistency here since we're painting close to the bread and the butter, so I don't want the color to be too strong. I'm just using this color to paint some more textures for the butter, especially around the edges, just to make the butter look a little bit more raised compared to the bread. This will just elevate the height slightly and suggest some volume as well. Since I want the base color of the bread to be very light, I pick up the same color and I added a lot of water into it, and also pick up some of the paint that I've already placed down on paper, then just smudge the edges until I reach the edge of the bread, and this will automatically dampen the surface as well. While the surface is still slightly damp, I'm going to paint the edge of the crust, and for this I'm using the same mixture with added Quin Sienna. I also want to dampen the bottom of the crust, so here I just use water, and using the same color as the crust previously, I'm just going to cover that whole area lightly before adding on the textures on top. Now I'm going to add the darker value. For this, I'm using the same mixture with added Quin Sienna to make it slightly more rich and a bit of sepia. With this, I'm going to just dot in some textures with the tip of my brush and also lining some of the edges, making sure that the edges are a bit more defined and slightly uneven, so there are areas which are light and some areas which are slightly darker. Still working with the damp surface, I'm slowly bringing up the value by adding more sepia into the mix, and I'm making smaller additions with this darker color for extra texture and depth. I'm just going to wait for the crust to dry, and since the butter area should be completely dry by now, I'm going to paint on the leaves on top of the strawberry jam. And for this, I'm using a mix of Hooker's Green, Yellow Ochre, and also Hansa Yellow Medium. Notice how I've mixed my paint on my palette. Even though I mixed those three colors together, I still keep them separated on my palette, so I have three tones that I can access very easily. When I'm painting on the leaves, I like to start with the yellow-green first, then while the surface is still damp, I added the green that is more rich, which has more Hooker's Green. It helps to angle the brush according to the angle of the leaf as you're painting them freehand. However, if you're not comfortable with painting this freehand, I will also have the outline available in my coffee shop, which will have all these drawn out. While the surface is still cold to the touch, so it's still slightly damp and not completely dry, I'm going to add an even darker value. So this is from a mix of Hooker's Green with a little bit of sepia. I'm adding the darker value mostly to the edges of the leaves. Sometimes I like to paint around the sides as well, just for extra definition. Also notice that I'm using a really light brush load to paint this, so I can control how fast the paint will flow out of my bristles. Now onto my favorite part to paint, which is the strawberry jam. I first use a thin consistency and a medium to heavy brush load of vermilion, and I'm just painting around the outline as well as leave out some white negative space in between. Then I added some Crimson Lake into the vermilion, and using a slightly thicker consistency, I'm just dotting around the inside. Another way of painting this is to paint using the light consistency for the outer edges. Then I continue on the inside of the strawberry using the vermilion and Crimson Lake mix. I also left out some white negative space in between for the glossy highlights. I'm not really thinking about anything in particular when I'm leaving out the white negative space. I just somewhat wiggle my brush randomly, leaving out some of those areas empty. And I'm just going to keep using the same technique to paint all of the strawberries. You can try both of the techniques and see which one you prefer. Personally, I like using the thin consistency around the edges, then continuing with a thicker consistency in the middle, because I find that the thicker consistency is a bit more rich this way and it flows a little better to the outer edges. Looking at this again, I felt like the empty side on the left here looks a little bit awkward, so I decided to just paint a quarter or 1/3 of the strawberry shaped jam, and it's fine to leave out those highlights still since the base color is fairly light. Now that the previous jam is more or less dry by now, I'm going to follow this up with an even more rich red. So this is a thicker consistency of the mixture between vermilion and Crimson Lake, and I'm just painting it as before, wiggling my brush randomly. I left out more negative shapes so the base color is still showing, and I also try to not paint on top of the white spaces as well. I'm painting this right at the center though, still leaving the edges of the jam lighter than the center. Once I'm done, I'm going to add more texture to the butter. I'm using the previous color mixture from Gray of Gray, Yellow Ochre, and Shine Brilliant Dark. This time my brush was also a little bit dirty from the vermilion or the red, so it has a slight warmth to the color instead, and I just used it again to paint some random textures very lightly. Now for the texture of the bread, I'm using that color mixture with a little bit of the crust mixture, which has Quin Sienna and a touch of sepia. And I'm still using a really light consistency. I try to create dots in different sizes. Some are more ovals and some are really tiny dots. You can also switch to a smaller brush for this. And I'm painting right next to the crust itself, and I'm essentially trying to create a transition of color between the lighter color of the bread and the crust. Be very careful when you're painting this because we are painting the bread texture. We don't want to accidentally make it too dark, so I'm working with really thin layers with a really thin consistency that you can always build up along the way. While I'm at it, I'm also going to define the face at the bottom of the crust, and I'm using the same mixture. This has sepia and Quin Sienna, just dampening it using a medium to light consistency. Then I added more sepia in the mix and added more of this darker color around the edges of the crust to separate the different faces of the bread. Next, I'm going to paint the seeds on the see-through jam, and for this I'm using a mix of Vermilion, Crimson Lake, as well as a little bit of sepia. I'm just going to dot it randomly on the area of the jam. For the outer part of the jam, which is lighter, I try to use a lighter mixture as well, so this has more of the red in the ratio, whereas for the center of the jam, which is more of a darker red, I try to add a bit more sepia, so there's more contrast between the darker colors as well. I feel like I still need to define some of the leaves, so I'm just outlining those leaves to separate them using a mix of Hooker's green and a little bit of sepia. By the way, for the final details, you can always switch to a smaller brush. This brush just happened to still have a fine point since I don't use it very often, so I'm just going to stick with using this one brush to finish the whole painting, but you can always switch using the brush that you have the most control over. Now for the real strawberries, I just used the same color for the leaves as I did for the leaves on the jam. This is a mix of Hooker's green with yellow ochre and Hansa yellow medium. And I just changed up the ratio for the darker green. For this one, it looks a little bit more earthy because it has more yellow ochre and Hansa yellow. I also mix a little bit of red in there. But just like before, while the surface is still damp, I like to use the darker green as well for a slight variation in color. And because the surface is still damp, I'm just going to leave them to dry for now and move on to paint the little jam blobs. I'm using the same color as the previous strawberry jam. This is from a mix of Vermilion and Crimson Lake, and I'm using a thicker consistency for the inside while leaving out some of those negative shapes. This time I tried to follow the shape of the circle just because it's much easier to paint that way. I decided to paint a few more than what I initially sketched. I also accidentally smudged a bit of red on the right, so I just painted more of the jam over it. Let's move on to the strawberries. I'm using a mix of Vermilion with a little bit of Crimson Lake, and I'm using a medium consistency. I painted dots in the area where the highlight's going to be. Then I just painted around it, leaving a bit of white space where the dots previously were. While the surface is still damp, I follow it up with a thicker consistency and more Crimson Lake in the mixture. Then for the top part, I added some Hansa yellow medium, so there's a gradation from more of an orangey yellow to the really deep red at the bottom. You can paint this a little bit neater, but I didn't want to go into too much detail for this one because I want the jam to be the main focal point. So I just painted the strawberries loosely. If you want this to be neater though, you can paint with a bit more intention and paint the ovals carefully and neatly instead of just making those suggestions for the textures. Here I added some bleed-proof white on top of the first strawberry. This is because I accidentally covered too much of the highlighted area, which is why I mentioned that the bleed-proof white is optional before. Now that the blobs are completely dry, I added the darker red. This is from a mix of Vermilion and Crimson Lake in a thick consistency with a little bit of sepia for an even darker red. And going back to the strawberries, now that they're completely dry, I also added a layer using that dark red to add a little bit more texture. Here for the center of the flower, I used a mix of Hansa Yellow Medium with a bit of Vermilion to make the yellow more rich. Then I added some of that creamy color from the bread. Then I just painted some tiny lines for a bit of texture following the angle of each of those petals. I'm then going to follow this up by cleaning my brush and using a clean, damp brush to pick up some of the previous paint from those lines and spread it across to the ends of the petals. This will create a really light consistency of the color, making the flower look more delicate. I'm also going to apply the same thing for the flower on top here. I decided to add some leaves as well to fill in the space. This is just the previous green mixture from Hooker's Green, Hansa Yellow Medium, and a little bit of yellow ochre. You can play around with the ratio to create the tone of green that you would like. Second strawberry is completely dry, so here I added more of the textures using the dark red. I wasn't sure what color I should paint this, so I just used the yellow mixture to complement the center of the flowers. This is from Hansa Yellow Medium with a bit of Vermilion, and I also left out white negative space on the side to make this look kind of puffy. As a final touch-up for the flowers, I added some brown to the yellow mixture, and I just painted dots surrounding the center of the flower to add a bit more depth and form. Then using a slightly lighter consistency and a really light load on my brush, I decided to outline each of the petals to give a bit more definition. If it's a bit hard for you to do this with your brush, you can also use colored pencil. After painting all of the elements, I felt like things were still floating here and there, so I decided to just fix up certain areas by increasing some of the shadows. I also decided to add some cast shadows. This is from Paynes Gray Bluish that I mix into the browns that I still had on my palette, and I'm just going to paint this underneath all of the elements that I painted beforehand using a thin consistency because I don't want it to overpower the main elements of the painting. After painting on the light consistency, I'm going to follow this up with a slightly thicker consistency that I paint on top, and I'm using the slightly darker value closer to the items so the shadow itself doesn't look flat. And I'm just going to keep painting the rest of the shadow till I'm done with all of the elements. I'm just going to add a few final touch-ups for the shadows, and that's basically it for this one. I hope you guys enjoyed this fun little painting, and if you guys like this tutorial and would like to see more, please consider subscribing for more content like this. I upload new ones every Friday. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box. If you guys are still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!